The winter of 1944 did not arrive with the promise of a new year, but with the rattling, icy breath of a dying empire. Across the splintering borders of the Third Reich, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of coal smoke, damp wool, and the metallic tang of impending doom. By the end of that year, after a series of staggering military defeats on both the eastern and western fronts, the regime found itself on a desperate defensive, its territories shrinking like a tightening noose around the throat of Berlin. While the High Command moved phantom divisions across maps that no longer matched the blood-soaked geography of the European soil, a different kind of army stood watch within the interior, an army of women who wore the death's head insignia, the wardens of the Reich's darkest corners. These were the women of the SS Gefolge, the female auxiliaries. Though technically classified as civilian employees to circumvent the traditional male-only laws of the SS, they were bound heart and soul to the machinery of terror. At the outbreak of the conflict in 1939, approximately 140,000 women were already associated with the German armed forces, with 90,000 serving as auxiliaries. As the war ground on and the manpower of the Wehrmacht was devoured by the frozen steppes of Russia and the hedgerows of Normandy, this number swelled. They were the telephone operators, the radio clerks, and most notoriously, the Aufseherinnen, the female guards who paced the perimeter fences of the concentration camp system. For these women, the twilight of 1944 was a world of sharp contrasts. In the macro view, the Reich was a crumbling fortress, its cities reduced to smoking craters by Allied moral bombing, and its industry retreating into subterranean tunnels. In the micro view of the camp barracks, the wardens still maintained a terrifying artificial order. They lived in a reality of polished leather boots, iron keys, and absolute authority over the wretched of the earth. In places like Auschwitz, the daughters of high-ranking officials grew up in isolated environments where the screams of the camp were dismissed as mere background noise to an idyllic childhood. They lived in comfortable villas with gardens where prisoners in striped suits worked the soil, a landscape of domesticity built atop a foundation of ash. The silence in these camps was often louder than the shelling on the front lines. It was a silence of complicity, a generation of women who had been methodically stripped of empathy through years of ideological conditioning. They were told they were the elite within the elite, the guardians of racial hygiene. But as the frost began to crack the stone foundations of the Reich, that silence was increasingly interrupted by the low rumble of Soviet artillery in the east. The however of history was beginning to pivot. The masters were soon to become the hunted. They stood at the edge of a precipice, still clutching their whips, even as the sky turned a bruised, apocalyptic purple with the glow of distant fires. These women were not merely witnesses to the tragedy. They were the enforcers of its most intimate cruelties. While the soldiers in the foxholes of the Ardennes fought for meters of frozen ground, the SS women fought to maintain the delusion of a 1,000-year reign that was currently being measured in weeks. They were the wardens of a world that was rapidly vanishing into the snow. The philosophical echo of their service would haunt the coming decades, the realization that the same hands that tucked children into bed at night were the hands that turned the keys on the barracks of the doomed. As we move toward the final collapse, we must reflect on the cost of this devotion. The earth remembers the weight of those boots, and the wind that howled across the Polish plains in late 1944 carried with it the names of those who were about to be swept into the storm. For the SS women, the fall was not just a military defeat, it was a total erasure of the identity they had forged in the shadow of the swastika. They were about to face a reckoning that knew no gender, a cold transition from the sharp uniform of the victor to the shaved head of the prisoner. The logistics of the Third Reich's final years were defined by a desperate, cannibalistic consumption of its own population. As the Wehrmacht's manpower was devoured by the relentless fire of the Eastern Front and the grinding attrition of Normandy, the interior of the Reich faced a critical vacuum. To maintain the machinery of the state and its vast archipelago of terror, the regime turned to its women. By 1944, the mobilization was total. Nearly 300,000 women were associated with the military apparatus of the Reich, with 50,000 in administrative roles and 90,000 serving as auxiliaries. However, the most chilling manifestation of this mobilization was the recruitment of the Aufseherinnen, the female guards who would oversee the concentration camp system. The recruitment process was a cold, bureaucratic exercise in the destruction of conscience. In the early years of the war, many women volunteered, drawn by the promise of high wages, stable housing, and the prestige of the SS uniform. They were ordinary women, teachers, factory workers, and housewives, who saw the SS Gefolge not as an entry into a nightmare, but as a career path in the new order. But as the war turned against Germany in 1943, the however of history intervened. The volunteer pool dried up, and recruitment became a matter of conscription. Labor offices began to funnel women into essential war work at the camps, presenting the role of a guard as no different from a position in a munitions factory. The primary forge for these female wardens was Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, located 80 kilometers north of Berlin. The atmosphere of Ravensbrück was defined by the sensory density of the Baltic coast, a damp, biting wind that carried the scent of pine and salt, often mingling with the heavy industrial odor of coal smoke from the camp's workshops. The weather was a constant, grey oppression, with low clouds that seemed to trap the screams of the inmates within the electrified perimeter. It was here that the SS began the methodical stripping of empathy from its new recruits. Training at Ravensbrück was not merely about the logistics of keys and rosters, it was an education in dehumanization. The macro vision of Himmler's racial purity was translated into the micro-reality of the guards' daily routine. Recruits were taught to view the prisoners, women often much like themselves, as Untermenschen, subhumans. They were instructed that any sign of compassion was a betrayal of the Reich and a weakness of the spirit. The training manuals emphasized the death's head ethos that the camp was a front line in the war for racial hygiene, and the guard was its elite defender. The silence of the training grounds was often louder than the drills. It was the silence of thousands of women learning to ignore the evidence of their own eyes. They watched the arrivals at the railway sidings, the shivering lines of the starving, and the children clutching at skirts. They were told that these were the enemies of the state. To survive the psychological weight of their role, many adopted a mask of cold apathy, a trait later described by psychologists who interviewed camp commanders as a hallmark of the SS mind. This apathy was the psychological armor they wore, just as real as the sharp wool of their uniforms. The architect's plan for these women was to create a generation of enforcers who could manage the domestic front while the men fought for the borders. However, the irony was that these women, often recruited to protect German families, became the wardens of a system that destroyed the very concept of the family. They were the daughters and mothers of the Reich, yet their hands were daily occupied with the mechanics of misery. They lived in comfortable quarters with flowers in the windows, mere meters away from the barracks of the doomed. Reflecting on the cost of this recruitment, one must look past the casualty lists and into the fractured souls of the perpetrators. A generation of women was methodically buried in the snow of Nazi ideology before a single shot was fired in their direction. They were forged into the overseers of the new order, believing they were the elite of a 1,000-year empire. They did not yet know that the empire was currently being measured in months, and that the keys they held so tightly would soon become the evidence of their own condemnation. The earth at Ravensbrück remembers the weight of those boots and the damp chill of the Baltic wind that swept through the training squares. As the Red Army began its crimson surge from the east, the training ended and the reality of the collapse began. The wardens of Ravensbrück would soon learn that the authority they had been gifted by the SS was a poison that would haunt them long after the camps were liberated. To understand the fate of the women captured in the ruins of the Reich, one must first understand the place that forged them. Ravensbrück was a landscape of deceptive beauty. It was a place where the dark, jagged pines of the Brandenburg forest met the grey, shifting waters of Lake Schwetzee. The geography was defined by marshland and mist, a damp, low-lying basin where the Baltic wind would howl through the barracks with a piercing, rhythmic cruelty. This was the shadow of Ravensbrück, the only major concentration camp in the Nazi system built exclusively for women, and it served as the grim laboratory for the SS Gefolge. Here, the macro vision of a purified German state was distilled into the micro-horror of a single cell or a single lash. The atmosphere of the camp was a sensory assault of industrial decay and natural indifference. The air was perpetually heavy, thick with the oily soot of the crematorium that settled like a grey shroud over the neatly raked gravel paths. In the winter, the temperature would plummet, turning the marshy ground into a treacherous sheet of black ice. We zoom in on the Appellplatz, the roll call square where thousands of women stood for hours in the pre-dawn gloom. The only sounds were the chattering of teeth, the distant barking of German shepherds, and the rhythmic, metallic clack, clack, clack of the Aufseherinnen's boots. For the guards, the weather was an inconvenience to be managed with heavy wool capes and leather gloves. For the prisoners, the weather was a slow-acting executioner. We look closer at a single figure among the wardens, Dorothea Binz. At 20 years old, she was a daughter of the local soil, a girl who had grown up in the nearby town of Fürstenberg. To the prisoners, she was a beautiful beast, a woman who moved with a terrifying predator-like grace through the barracks. The micro-story of Binz is the story of the SS training at its most effective. She did not arrive as a monster, she was crafted into one. She lived in a comfortable room with floral curtains, just a few hundred meters from the bunker, the camp's punishment block, where the walls were stained with the desperate scrawls of the doomed. Binz would often spend her afternoons cycling through the forest or rowing on the lake, the idyllic beauty of the German countryside providing a psychological buffer against the atrocities she oversaw by morning. This was the irony of the SS woman's life, a domesticity maintained in the literal shadow of a smokestack. The philosophical echo of Ravensbrück was the total erasure of the feminine as a source of mercy. In the camp's ideology, a woman's natural role as a nurturer was redirected into the protection of the racial community. To be a good SS woman was to be harder than the men, to prove that one's commitment to the Führer was not tempered by sentimentality. This pivot reveals the chilling reality of this devotion. It was meant to be a service to life, to the future of the Aryan race. However, it manifested as a meticulous stewardship of death. The silence of the forest outside the wire was louder than the screams within, a testament to how easily a society can turn its back on the neighbor when the state provides the blindfold. One survivor, a French resistance fighter, later wrote in her secret diary that the guards looked at them but did not see them. They saw only the numbers on their arms, the dirt on their skin. They had replaced their eyes with glass. This was the sensory density of the camp, the coldness of the gaze, the texture of the coarse prisoner cloth against the skin, and the smell of thin, watery turnip soup that offered no warmth against the Brandenburg frost. The guards, like Binz, were masters of the macro-logistics. They could tell you exactly how many calories were saved by cutting rations, or how many uniforms could be produced in the camp's Siemens factory. They were the accountants of agony. But as 1944 bled into 1945, the shadow of Ravensbrück began to lengthen in a way the wardens had not anticipated. The distant rumble of Stalin's organs began to vibrate in the very marrow of the camp's foundations. The weather grew even more bitter, and the coal supplies dwindled. The guards, who had spent years stripping the prisoners of their humanity, now began to feel the first tremors of their own vulnerability. The masks of stone they had worn so proudly began to crack. They began to realize that the great German Empire was a house of cards, and the wind from the east was about to blow it down. The earth at Ravensbrück remembers the weight of those boots, but it also remembers the moment the keys began to shake in the warden's hands. The silence was about to be broken by the chaos of retreat. The shadow was no longer just a metaphor for the camp's influence. It was the darkness of a coming storm that would leave no stone unturned and no record unexamined. A generation of women who had buried their conscience in the snow of Ravensbrück was about to discover that the snow eventually melts, and what lies beneath is never truly forgotten. By January 1945, the map of the Third Reich was a document written in disappearing ink. On the general's map, the situation was catastrophic. The Soviet Vistula Oder offensive had torn through the German lines like a hot blade through wax, moving the front nearly 300 miles closer to Berlin in a matter of weeks. From the macro perspective, the Great Retreat was a logistical nightmare of shattered divisions and clogged arteries. However, for the SS women stationed in the east, the retreat was a visceral, terrifying descent into the very chaos they had helped to orchestrate. As the Red Army surged forward, a crimson tide of 4 million men seeking vengeance for the millions of their own who had perished, the female wardens of camps like Auschwitz, Stutthof, and Gross-Rosen were forced to confront a reality they had never imagined: the collapse of their absolute power. The weather in the Polish plains during that winter was a character in the tragedy itself. It was a landscape of bone-white horizons and sky the color of lead. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, a cold so profound it felt like a physical weight on the chest. We zoom in from the grand strategy to the mud and ice of the evacuation routes. The death marches had begun. The SS women, who had once stood on high platforms in polished boots, were now forced into the slush and the freezing wind. They marched alongside their prisoners, yet the divide remained. While the guards wore heavy fur-lined coats and carried rations of bread and sausage, the women they drove before them were clad in nothing but thin striped rags and wooden clogs that shattered on the frozen earth. The smell of the retreat was not the smell of glory. It was the scent of wet wool, diesel exhaust from retreating tigers, and the metallic tang of blood in the snow. The logistics of this retreat were defined by a frantic effort to erase the past. In the final days before the Red Army arrived, the order from the SS High Command was clear: no prisoner must fall into the hands of the enemy alive. We see the Aufseherinnen in the camp offices, their breath blooming in the unheated rooms as they fed thousands of files into the stoves. The smoke that rose from the chimneys of Auschwitz in January 1945 was no longer just the ash of the murdered. It was the charred remains of the bureaucracy of death, the lists, the quotas, and the personnel records that linked these women to their crimes. They believed that by burning the paper, they could burn the memory. However, the witnesses were still walking, a living indictment that the guards were now forced to herd toward the interior of a shrinking Germany. The micro story of this retreat can be seen in the eyes of a guard on the road from Stutthof. She had spent 3 years in the relative comfort of the administrative block, but now she was a refugee in a uniform that had become a target. Every time a Soviet Yak-3 fighter buzzed low over the column, the hierarchy of the Reich dissolved into the ditches. In the chaos, the guards were often more afraid of the civilian treks, the millions of German refugees fleeing the east, than they were of the prisoners. The roads were a churning mass of horse-drawn wagons, weeping children, and discarded military hardware. The SS women found themselves anonymous in the sea of misery, yet their black and silver insignias acted like a lightning rod for the growing resentment of the regular German soldiers, who saw the SS as the architects of this final, inevitable ruin. The turning point of the retreat was the realization of vulnerability. For years, these women had been the masters of the small death, the individual executions, and the daily brutalities. Now they were surrounded by the great death of a dying empire. The silence of the Polish woods was punctuated by the rhythmic crack of Mauser rifles as guards executed those who could no longer keep pace. The philosophical echo here is profound. As the Reich collapsed, the only thing it had left to export was its cruelty. The guards were no longer defending a border or an ideology. They were merely killing to keep the silence of their own futures. "God had forgotten us here," a guard reportedly whispered to a colleague as they crossed the Oder River into the relative safety of the German interior. But God was not the one they should have feared. It was the men in the T-34 tanks who were crushing the very earth they had just walked upon. The sensory density of the retreat concludes at the gates of the safety camps, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück, which were now bursting at the seams with the human debris of the East. The SS women who arrived there were exhausted, frostbitten, and increasingly desperate. They had traded the vast horizons of the Eastern conquests for the cramped, typhus-ridden barracks of a homeland that was burning from above. They had survived the mud and the Red Army advance, but they had carried the stench of the camps with them. The frost of 1945 had preserved their bodies, but it could not hide the marks on their souls. The earth remembers the blood in the snow, and as the spring thaw approached, the secrets they had tried to bury in the East were about to be unearthed by the advancing Allies in the West. The spring of 1945 in Bohemia did not arrive with the gentle promise of renewal, but with the hollow, haunting realization that the world had ended. In the city of Pilsen, the air was a strange, suffocating cocktail of blooming lilacs and the acrid, metallic stench of burning diesel and rubber. On the general's map, the liberation of Czechoslovakia looked like a race between the Western Allies and the Red Army, a frantic competition for the remnants of Central Europe. Yet in the narrow streets and temporary barracks of northern Pilsen, the macro-politics of the coming Cold War were distilled into the micro-terror of nearly 100 women who had served the machinery of the SS. These were the SS Helferinnen, the signal auxiliaries, the radio operators, and the administrative clerks who had fled the advancing Russians, only to find themselves cornered in the relative temporary sanctuary of the American lines. The atmosphere in the Pilsen detention center was thick with a desperate, practiced femininity. These women, many in their early 20s, had spent the war years as the voices of the Reich, transmitting the orders that moved armies and sealed the fates of millions. Now they were a choir without a conductor. They had traded their sharp grey uniforms for whatever civilian clothes they could scavenge, yet the posture of the SS remained, a rigid, defiant grace that the American GIS found both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The choir was visible even in their silence. The weather was unusually warm for May, a bright, mocking sun that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the barracks where the women were held. To the Americans of the 16th Armored Division, these were not the monsters depicted in the propaganda reels. They were young women who looked like the sisters and sweethearts they had left behind in Ohio or Pennsylvania. This was the micro-story of the Pilsen Sparrows, a moment where the binary of enemy and human became dangerously blurred. To secure better treatment and perhaps buy their way into the good graces of their captors, the women formed a choir and called themselves the Pilsen Sparrows. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the jagged ruins of the city's industrial district, their voices would rise from the barred windows of the barracks, singing traditional German folk songs and sentimental ballads. The singing had a philosophical echo. They used the very culture the Reich had claimed to protect as a shield against the consequences of their service. The silence of the American guards, who gathered outside to listen, was a silence of confusion. One private reportedly wrote home that they sounded like angels, until you remembered what they had been whispering into their headsets just a month earlier. The singing created a sensory density that masked the smell of the crematoria they had ignored and the sound of the telegrams they had sent. Those telegrams had brought death to so many American families. Meanwhile, the geography of the peace was as rigid and unforgiving as the geography of the war. The pivot of post-war control was being negotiated in the grand halls of Yalta and Potsdam. The Americans were staying in Pilsen only as long as the temporary demarcation lines allowed. The city was destined for the Soviet zone. When the news finally filtered down to the barracks that the American forces would be withdrawing and handing over all enemy personnel to the Soviet administration, the singing stopped. The Pilsen Sparrows were suddenly silenced. The atmosphere changed overnight from one of cautious charm to one of absolute, paralyzing dread. The women knew that while the Americans might be moved by a song, the Red Army was moved only by a debt of blood that could never be fully repaid. The logistics of the handover were carried out with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency that mirrored the SS's own methods. In the pre-dawn mist of a damp morning, the women were loaded onto trucks. The sensory details of that departure were defined by the sound of weeping and the frantic, rhythmic scrubbing of skin. Many women tried to use the last of their soap to wash away any traces of their service, as if the water of Bohemia could cleanse the stains of the SS. As the American trucks pulled away and the Soviet officers stepped forward, the macro-micro zoom reveals the shift in power. The Americans looked away, their duty to the alliance outweighing any individual sympathy for the Sparrows. The women were no longer a choir. They were labelled war booty, a status that stripped them of the last remnants of their identity as elite auxiliaries. The Pilsen Sparrows disappeared into the vast dark maw of the Soviet penal system. Their fate is a vignette of the total collapse. For these women, the war did not end with a surrender. It transitioned into a long, silent struggle for survival in the labor camps of the East. The irony was complete. Those who had helped build a system of industrial slavery were now its newest victims. The earth in Pilsen remembers the songs they sang, but the silence that followed their departure was much louder. It was the silence of a generation that had played its part in a tragedy and was now being written out of history by the very machine they had served. Today, the barracks are gone, and flowers grow where the wire once stood, but the air still carries the echo of a choir that sang to save itself from a fate it had helped create. The month of April 1945 did not arrive with the warmth of spring in Lower Saxony. It came with a damp, clinging mist that hung low over the stunted pines of the Lüneburg Heath. On the general's map, the British Second Army was carving a path through northwest Germany, their armoured columns bypassing pockets of resistance to strike at the heart of the Reich's industrial north. The advance halted at a patch of geography that appeared on no tactical map of military value, Bergen-Belsen. Originally designed as a star camp for privileged prisoners, it had become by the final weeks of the war a terminal collection point for the human wreckage of the East. The atmosphere here was not merely grim, it was a sensory abyss. The air was not air, it was a thick, cloying fog of rot, a sweet and heavy stench of unburied thousands that could be smelled by the advancing British tanks 5 miles before they ever saw the wire. When the men of the 11th Armoured Division finally breached the gates on April the 15th, 1945, they entered a landscape that defied human comprehension. From the macro perspective, Belsen was a logistical catastrophe, a camp with no food, no water, and a typhus epidemic that was claiming hundreds of lives an hour. But as we zoom in to the soldiers' foxhole perspective, the horror became intimate. The British Tommies found themselves walking through a nightmare of the living dead, yet standing amidst the mounds of the unburied were the wardens. To the shock of the liberators, they found dozens of SS women, Aufseherinnen, who appeared remarkably well-fed, their uniforms pressed, their leather boots polished to a high sheen. They stood with a terrifying, practiced indifference, as if the mountain of corpses at their feet were merely a bookkeeping error. The micro-story of Belsen is often personified by one woman, Irma Gries. At only 21 years old, she was the head of the female work service. Survivors described her as having angelic features, blonde hair, blue eyes, a face that belonged in a propaganda poster for the ideal German maiden. The reality was the beautiful beast. Gries moved through the camp with a heavy whip and a pistol, her presence a sensory density of fear. She was known to set trained, half-starved Alsatians on prisoners for the slightest infraction. To Gries and her colleagues, the prisoners were no longer people. They were the iron cage of their own ideology. They had spent years stripping others of their humanity, and in doing so, they had cauterized their own. The philosophical echo of Belsen is found in this transition, the moment the British soldiers realized that these women, who looked like their sisters at home, were the architects of a cruelty that surpassed the battlefield. The pivot of Belsen occurred within hours of the liberation. The SS guards, both male and female, initially expected to be treated as disarmed enemy forces with the professional courtesies of war. They believed the white flag flown over the camp during the brief truce to prevent the spread of typhus would protect them. The British were no longer merely soldiers, they were witnesses to a crime against the very concept of civilization. The mercy the SS had denied the prisoners was now denied to them. Under the barrels of Sten guns, the SS women were forced into the pits. The logistics of the cleanup were a brutal, visceral reckoning. These women, who had once ordered prisoners to move the dead until they collapsed, were now forced to pick up the typhus-ridden bodies with their bare hands. They were made to load them into trucks and drag them to the mass graves, their polished boots quickly becoming caked in the mud and filth of their own making. The sensory density of those days was defined by the sound of the British bulldozers pushing thousands of bodies into the earth, and the rhythmic, exhausted sobbing of the guards who were finally breaking under the weight of what they had done, or perhaps, more accurately, the weight of what was being done to them. The weather remained grey and indifferent, a cold rain falling on the iron cage as the British forced the guards to sleep in the same lice-infested barracks they had previously overseen. The smell of the lime used to disinfect the pits mingled with the smell of the guards' own sweat and terror. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been pulverized. Reflecting on the cost, we see that Belsen was the place where the world's perception of the SS woman changed forever. They were no longer the invisible auxiliaries of the Reich, they were the faces of the Holocaust. The silence that had once protected their activities was shattered by the clicking of British cameras, and the rolling of film that would soon be shown in cinemas across the globe. Today, the site of Bergen-Belsen is a quiet meadow. The barracks burned to the ground by the British to stop the plague. Flowers grow where the mass graves were dug, but the earth remembers the texture of that spring. It remembers the well-fed women in their sharp uniforms, and the moment the iron cage they had built for others finally slammed shut on themselves. By the summer of 1945, the guns had finally fallen silent across the charred remains of the continent, but a new, quieter war had begun in the shadow of the ruins. On the general's map, Europe looked like a cartographic nightmare of displaced persons camps, occupation zones, and C-category screening centers. Millions of people were in motion: refugees, former slave laborers, and surrendering soldiers, creating a sea of humanity in which the guilty hoped to drown. For the Allied intelligence services, the logistics of the peace were as daunting as the logistics of the invasion. They had to sift through this mountain of wreckage to find the architects and enforcers of the Holocaust. This was the era of the interrogator's desk, where the macro history of the Reich was dismantled, one individual testimony at a time. The atmosphere in these screening centers was defined by a sensory density of heat, dust, and the stale smell of cheap tobacco. We zoom in from the chaotic lines of prisoners to the claustrophobic confines of an interrogation room in a requisitioned schoolhouse. The weather was a relentless, humid heat that made the wool of the Allied uniforms itch, and the air in the small rooms feel like a physical weight. On the desk sat the only weapons that mattered now: a Leica camera, a typewriter, and a growing pile of Fragebogen, the 131 question dossiers designed to trap the liar. The light in these rooms was often harsh and unforgiving, catching the beads of sweat on the foreheads of women who, just weeks before, had held the power of life and death over thousands. A primary focus of these sessions was the identification of the SS blood group tattoo. For the men of the Waffen-SS, this small letter, A, B, or O, inked under the left arm, was a permanent brand of their allegiance. However, for the women of the SS Gefolge, the marking was less common, making the task of the interrogator a psychological duel rather than a physical search. We look at the micro-story of the screening lines, hundreds of women forced to stand shirtless in the summer sun as Allied doctors inspected their skin. Some women had attempted to burn away their insignia or use caustic soda to scar their skin where the SS runes had once been. Others used theatrical makeup scavenged from the ruins of Berlin to hide the telltale marks of their service. The silence of these inspections was punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of the rubber stamps, white, grey, or black, classifying the women by their level of complicity. In the interrogation chair, the however pivot became the standard defense. "I was only a secretary," they would say. "I only worked in the kitchen. I did not know what was happening behind the woods." They tried to retreat into the traditional roles of womanhood, hoping the Allies would view them as victims of a male-dominated regime. But the interrogators, many of whom were German-speaking Jews who had fled the Reich years earlier, brought a different sensory density to the room. They brought the smell of the camps. They laid out photographs of the mass graves from Belsen or Buchenwald on the scarred wooden desk and watched the woman's eyes. The philosophical echo of these moments was the confrontation with the banality of evil. These were not monsters from dark folklore. They were women who missed their cats, who worried about their mothers, yet who had spent years overseeing a factory of death. The logistics of truth were often found in small details. An interrogator might notice the way a woman held her hands, the calluses not of a farmhand, but the specific wear of someone who had carried a heavy ring of iron keys for 12 hours a day, or the way she reacted to the bark of a command, a reflexive snap to attention that no mere cook would possess. The micro-story of the interrogation was a battle of endurance. Outside, the world was moving on, rubble was being cleared, and the first Fräuleins were beginning to fraternize with occupying troops for chocolate and cigarettes. But inside the room, the clock ticked with mechanical finality. The interrogator was not just looking for a confession, he was looking for the crack in the mask of cold apathy that the SS training had installed. Reflecting on the cost of these screenings, we see the beginning of the great silence that would define post-war Germany. For every woman caught at the interrogator's desk, many more slipped through the net, trading their uniforms for the anonymity of the rubble women. The earth remembers the questions asked in those humid rooms, and the silence of those who refused to answer. The transition from elite warden to innocent bystander was a lie constructed under the flickering light of a desk lamp, a lie that would take decades to peel away. The desk was the final battlefield of the war, a place where the sharp lines of the uniform were replaced by the blurred grey areas of memory and guilt. While the courtrooms of the West began to fill with the quiet scratching of pans and the formal language of international law, the East offered a different, more visceral kind of reckoning. On the general's map, the boundary of the Elbe River had become a jagged scar across the heart of Europe, separating two worlds that viewed the concept of justice through entirely different lenses. For the Soviet Union, which had watched 27 million of its citizens vanish into the maw of the Nazi war machine, the capture of the SS was not a legal problem to be solved, but a debt of blood to be collected. This was vengeance in the steppe, a chapter of the collapse where the macro scale of the Red Army's advance met the micro agony of the individual captive in the frozen mud of the East. The atmosphere of the Soviet-occupied zones was defined by a sensory density of absolute, unmitigated ruin. The air was thick with the scent of Makhorka tobacco, diesel fumes from T-34 tanks, and the heavy, wet smell of the black earth of the plains being churned into a slurry by millions of boots. The weather in the spring of 1945 remained a bitter adversary, and the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had turned the roads into treacherous canals of filth. We zoom in from the grand strategic movement of the fronts to a small clearing near the border of East Prussia. Here, a group of female SS auxiliaries, captured while attempting to flee the encirclement of Königsberg, were gathered under the watchful eyes of the NKVD. These women, who had spent the war in the sterile administration blocks of the eastern camps, were now forced to confront the soldiers whose families they had helped to systematically erase. The micro-story of these captures was often marked by a terrifying brevity. In many instances, the pivot of history was instantaneous. The women expected the honor of a military surrender, clinging to the belief that their status as females would afford them a layer of protection. The Soviet soldiers saw no women in these captives. They saw only fritzes in skirts. In the chaotic final days, over 200 female personnel were reported to have been summarily executed or tortured to death in the forests of the East, their bodies left as markers in the snow for the advancing columns. For those who were not executed on the spot, the fate was often a slow descent into the silence of the Gulag. They were stripped of their boots, luxury items in the Soviet army, and forced to march barefoot through the slush toward the railheads that would carry them to the interior of the USSR. The philosophical echo of the Eastern capture was the total collapse of the Reich's racial hierarchy. The women who had been taught that they were the Aryan elite now found themselves at the very bottom of a new, brutal social order. They were no longer the wardens, they were the war booty. In the transit camps of the East, the sensory life was hunger and the constant rhythmic clanking of cattle cars. the silence of the Siberian winter was a different kind of cold than the Baltic wind of Ravensbrück, a cold that did not just bite the skin, but seemed to freeze the very memory of home. As they moved further east, the geography of their lives shifted from the Lebensraum they had hoped to colonize to the special settlements, where they would spend the next decade breaking stones and felling timber. The logistics of the Soviet penal system were vast and indifferent. While the Allies in the West were meticulously documenting every crime for the Nuremberg records, the Soviets were more interested in the labor value of the fascist she-wolves. Thousands of SS women were funneled into the labor camps of the Urals and Kazakhstan. We reflect on the irony of their situation. The very system of forced labor they had overseen in the camps of Poland was now the machine that consumed their own lives. They lived on 400 grams of black bread and watery soup. Their hands, once manicured and holding the keys to the barracks, were now cracked and bleeding from the labor of the mines. The macro of the Soviet reconstruction was built on the micro suffering of these captives, a generation of women buried not in the snow of the battlefield, but in the anonymity of the steppe. Today, the mass graves of the East remain largely unmarked, hidden beneath the vast, rolling wheat fields of what was once the bloodlands of the Reich. The earth remembers the screams that were lost in the roar of the Soviet artillery, and it remembers the silence of those who never returned from the deep interior. The vengeance in the steppe was a cycle of violence that knew no gender and offered no closure. It was the final brutal punctuation mark at the end of a sentence the SS had begun writing in 1939. As the sun set over the ruined horizons of 1945, the women of the SS learned that while the snow may cover the crime, the ice preserves the debt until it is paid in full. As the summer heat of 1945 gave way to the damp grey rot of autumn, thousands of SS women who had survived the initial chaos of capture found themselves entering a new and sterile kind of purgatory. On the general's map, Western Germany was no longer a nation, but a grid of occupation zones, a landscape of automatic arrest categories and containment enclosures. From the macro perspective, the Allies were faced with the logistical impossibility of housing and feeding nearly 4 million German personnel. To solve this, General Eisenhower designated the captives not as prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces, designated DEF. This was a cold, bureaucratic pivot that bypassed the Geneva Convention, stripping the prisoners of their right to standard rations, shelter, and medical care. For the women of the SS, the transition was a sensory shock that began with the silence of the cells. The atmosphere in the internment camps, such as the sprawling enclosures at Ludwigsburg or the muddy reaches of the Rheinwiesenlager, was defined by a profound, hollow exhaustion. The weather became a relentless adversary. A cold, persistent drizzle began to fall in September, turning the camps into vast basins of grey slurry. We moved from the barbed wire perimeters to the micro-reality of a single woman huddled against a wooden post. She no longer wore the tailored grey wool of the SS Gefolge. Her uniform had been stripped of its insignias, leaving only the ghost-like outlines of where the Death's Head and the eagles had once rested. The sensory world was one of pervasive dampness, the smell of wet earth, the metallic tang of rusted wire, and the low, constant hum of thousands of voices murmuring in the dark. In these open-air cages there were no barracks for the first few months, only holes dug into the ground to escape the wind. The logistics of these cells were designed to break the SS spirit. Interrogations continued, but the silence of the cells was where the real psychological toll was taken. The micro-story of this period appears in the diaries of the women held at internment camp number 76 at Hohenasperg. They were kept in isolation for 23 hours a day, The only sound, the rhythmic clink of the guards' boots on the stone corridor, a sound they themselves had once used to terrify others. The philosophical echo of their confinement was the total reversal of roles. One former guard from Ravensbrück wrote in a smuggled note that the silence there was heavier than the stones. It was as if the world had forgotten they were women and remembered only that they were the SS. They were forced to confront the reality that the 1,000-year empire had left them with nothing but a concrete floor and a thin, moth-eaten blanket. The silence was not just a lack of sound, it was a weapon used by Allied administrators to weed out the unrepentant. Guards would often play recordings of the Nuremberg trials through loudspeakers into the cells, voices of the High Command echoing through the stone halls as they blamed their subordinates or denied all knowledge of the camps. The sensory density of these broadcasts, the crackle of the radio, the distant recorded sobs of survivors, became a psychological siege. The pivot of internment was the realization of abandonment. The women realized that the men they had served, the commanders they had admired, were now deserting them in the courtrooms of history. The elite within the elite were now merely numbers in a filing cabinet, their names categorized under the C category for mandatory arrest and potential execution. The weather worsened as the first frost of November 1945 arrived, bringing a biting wind that cut through the drafty cells. In the Rheinwiesenlager, the meadow camps along the Rhine, thousands of women lived in conditions that mirrored the very camps they had once overseen. There were no beds, only the cold ground, no medicine for the dysentery that began to sweep through the ranks. The irony was a jagged, uncomfortable truth. The Allies, in their haste to process the guilty, had recreated the physical environment of the concentration camps, if only temporarily. The macro of the Allied victory was built on the micro of suffering that many at home in London or Washington would never hear about. The silence of the cells was a barrier that kept the messiness of the peace away from the triumphalism of the victory. Reflecting on the cost of this period, we see a generation of women who were being methodically erased. In the silence of the cells, many of them began to craft the great lie, the internal narrative that they were merely victims of circumstance, that they had seen nothing and done nothing. They buried their memories in the cold mud of the Rhine camps, preparing for the day they might be released back into a world that no longer had a place for them. The earth remembers the cold of that winter and the sound of the rain hitting the canvas tents. As the year turned to 1946, the silence was about to be broken by the gavel of the courtrooms as the individual wardens of the Reich were finally forced to stand in the light and answer for the shadows they had cast. In the autumn of 1945, the small timber-framed town of Lüneburg, largely spared the obliterating fire of the Allied air campaigns, became the stage for a reckoning the world had never before witnessed. On the general's map, the Belsen trial, formerly known as the trial of Joseph Kramer and 44 others, was the first major war crimes tribunal to be held under British military law, predating the international stage of Nuremberg. It was a logistical behemoth of legal precedent, an attempt to codify the unprecedented into the dry, rhythmic language of the courtroom. For the survivors who had travelled back from the edge of the abyss to testify, and for the women who sat in the dock, the trial was a visceral, sensory confrontation with the ghosts of the camp. The atmosphere in the Lüneburg gym, converted into a makeshift court, was defined by a heavy, airless tension. The air was thick with the scent of floor wax, old wood, and the stale sweat of the hundreds of spectators, journalists and soldiers who crowded the galleries to see the faces of the beasts of Belsen. We zoom in from the macro-strategic goal of denazification to the micro-reality of the dock. There, arranged in rows, sat the female defendants. They were no longer the formidable wardens of the Reich. They were stripped of their SS insignia and wearing drab, ill-fitting civilian clothes. Yet the sensory density of their presence remained. There was Elisabeth Volkenrath, the head warden, whose face was a mask of stern, unyielding defiance. There was Juana Bormann, known as the woman with the dogs, an older, diminutive figure who looked more like a grandmother than an executioner, a visual irony the press found deeply disturbing. And in the front row sat Irma Gries. At 22, her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her blue eyes scanned the room with a cold, predatory detachment. To the soldiers guarding them, the disconnect was total. These women looked like the girls from the villages outside the wire, yet the evidence being read into the record detailed a level of depravity that seemed to belong to another species. A pivotal turn in the trial was the introduction of film evidence. The defense had initially argued that conditions at Belsen were the result of the chaos of war, of Allied bombing disrupting supply lines, and of a typhus epidemic that some called an act of God. They portrayed the guards as overwhelmed administrators doing their best under impossible circumstances. The British prosecutors played the footage captured by the Army Film and Photographic Unit during the liberation. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound it was deafening. As the grainy black and white images of bulldozers pushing mountains of skeletal remains into the pits filled the screen, the mechanical clicking of the projector was the only sound. The light from the screen flickered across the faces of the defendants. Some looked away. Some, like Gries, watched with an expression of bored indifference. The philosophical echo was clear. The camera had captured a truth no legal maneuver could erase. The Earth had given up its secrets, and the film was the silent witness the SS could not intimidate. The micro-story of the testimony focused on survivors such as Anita Lasker-Volpisch, a young woman who had survived because she played the cello in the camp orchestra. As she spoke, her voice thin but steady in the humid air of the courtroom, she reconstructed the daily sensory reality of the camp, the smell of the burning, the sound of the whips, and the specific individual cruelties of the women in the dock. She looked directly at Gries and recounted how the Angel of Death had selected prisoners for the gas chambers with the flick of a finger, all while wearing her signature perfume. The contrast was a sensory assault, the sweetness of the scent against the stench of the dead. The logistics of the testimony were grueling. Over 54 days, the court heard from dozens of witnesses who had to relive their trauma in front of their former tormentors. The silence that followed each testimony was the weight of a generation that had been methodically destroyed. As the trial reached its climax in November 1945, the weather outside turned into a biting, damp frost that mirrored the cold finality of the proceedings. On November 17, 1945, the verdicts were read. For many of the lower-level guards, there were sentences of imprisonment, years of hard labor that would eventually be commuted as the world moved toward the Cold War. However, for the inner circle, Volkenrath, Bormann, and Gries, the gavel fell with the sound of a closing tomb. They were sentenced to death by hanging. The philosophical echo of the verdict was one of closure, yet it carried a bitter taste. No amount of hangings could balance the ledger of Belsen. The silence of the courtroom, as the sentences were delivered, was the silence of a world trying to convince itself that justice had been served. The final logistics of the Belsen trial took place on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin Prison. The weather was a grey, sunless shroud. The account focuses on Albert Pierrepoint, the British hangman, who had been flown in specifically for the task. He noted in his diary the mechanical precision of the executions. Irma Gries was the first to go. She walked to the gallows with a steady step, refusing the hood. Her final word was the German word schnell, meaning quickly. The rhythmic thud of the trapdoor was the final punctuation mark on her life. The logistics of death that she had overseen for so many thousands had finally claimed her. The macro view of the trial was a success for international law, but the micro view was a row of bodies in a prison yard, the physical manifestation of a regime that had finally run out of time. The trial delivered a legal success, and the yard recorded a human cost that could not be paid in verdicts. Today, the gym in Lüneburg is just a building, and the gallows at Hamelin are long gone. Flowers grow in the meadows where the camps once stood, but the earth remembers the weight of the boots and the sound of the gavel. The Belsen trial proved that the wardens of the Reich could be held to account, but it also revealed the terrifying reality that the most monstrous crimes can be committed by people who look exactly like us. The scars of history are not just in the ruins, they are in the realization of what is possible when the silence of the cells is replaced by the silence of the grave. As the fire of the Lüneburg trials faded and the first gallows were dismantled, a different kind of movement began beneath the surface of the occupied zones. On the general's map, the priorities of the Allied High Command were shifting with the speed of a winter gale. The macro goal of absolute denazification was colliding with the micro-reality of a continent that was starving, ruthless, and teetering on the edge of total social collapse. By 1947, the crusade in Europe was being replaced by the Cold War, and the need for a functioning West German state to serve as a bulwark against the Soviet East meant that the net used to catch SS was being cast with increasingly larger holes. This was the era of the Vanishing Act, a time when thousands of women who had served the death's head simply stepped into the shadows of the ruins and became ghosts in their own land. The atmosphere of Year Zero, 1945, and its immediate aftermath was a sensory density of pulverized mortar and the sweet, cloying scent of unrecovered bodies trapped beneath the rubble. In the cities of the Ruhr and the hollowed-out shell of Berlin, the air was perpetually grey, a thick curtain of brick dust that settled into the lungs and turned sunlight into a sickly yellow haze. We moved from administrative offices of the occupation to a forest outside Munich. There, the forest floor was littered with the discarded skin of the Reich, silver runes, leather belts, and the identifying papers of the SS Gefolge. For many women, the first act of survival was the literal burning of their identity. They traded sharp, tailored wool for the rags of refugees, rubbed soot into their skin to hide the well-fed glow of camp service, and blended into the endless columns of Heimkehrer, those returning home. The pivot of this period is found in the archetype of the Trümmer Frauen, the rubble women. History remembers them as the heroic figures who stood in lines amidst wreckage, passing bricks hand to hand to rebuild the nation. However, within these lines stood women whose hands had only months before gripped the handles of whips or the keys to barracks. The anonymity of the ruins was their greatest shield. In the chaotic logistics of post-war displacement, a woman could easily claim to be a widow from the lost Eastern territories, her records destroyed by fire in the bombing of Dresden or Breslau. They adopted new names, invented dead husbands, and moved to towns where no one knew the weight of their past. The sensory density of this life was the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of hammers against stone, a sound that served as a heartbeat for a new, silent Germany. The micro-story of the vanishing can be seen in the thousands of Persil-Scheine, the exoneration certificates nicknamed after a popular laundry detergent because they washed a person's record clean. As the Allied screening process became overwhelmed, the task of denazification was largely handed back to German-led Spruchkammern, lay courts. In these rooms, the logistics of truth were traded for the logistics of stability. Former colleagues and neighbors provided character references for one another in a massive, nationwide conspiracy of silence. A woman who had been a high-ranking auxiliary in a transit camp might be reclassified as a follower or minor offender, receive a small fine, and gain the right to return to civilian life. The philosophical echo of these courts was the realization that a society cannot function if half its population is behind bars. Justice was being sacrificed on the altar of reconstruction. The silence at the dinner table became the defining characteristic of the 1950s. We look at the domesticity of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. These women married, raised children, and lived in the neatly painted houses that rose from the craters. They became the grandmothers of the new Germany, women who were praised for their resilience and their hard work during the hungry years. Yet, beneath the floral dresses and the scent of baking bread, the memory of the camps remained, a cold, unexploded shell buried in the psyche. They never spoke of the Baltic wind at Ravensbrück or the smell of the chimneys at Auschwitz. The macro history of the Reich was being written in textbooks, but the micro history of the women who enforced it was being systematically erased by the mundane routine of suburban life. The sensory density of the Vanishing Act concludes with the realization that the earth hides its secrets well, but never perfectly. Occasionally, a face in a newspaper or a chance meeting at a train station would trigger a recognition, leading to a late-life trial in the 1960s or the 1970s. But for the vast majority, the vanishing was complete. They lived out their lives in the comfort of a democracy they had once despised, protected by the very great silence they had helped to build. The cost of this silence was a fractured national identity, a generation of children who grew up sensing a darkness in their mothers that had no name. Today, the rubble has been cleared and the cities are vibrant, but the vanishing remains a scar on the historical record, a reminder that while a uniform can be burned, the hands that wore it can never truly be washed clean. The modern landscape of Germany is a masterpiece of architectural amnesia and deliberate remembrance. On the general's map of the 21st century, the places we have discussed, Ravensbrück, Bergen-Belsen, the interrogation centers of the West, and the forgotten pits of the East, are no longer focal points of a war machine, but silent anchors of a collective conscience. From the macro perspective, the world has spent 8 decades attempting to categorize the SS-Gefolge into the neat boxes of history, the monsters, the victims, or the bystanders. However, in the micro-reality of the Brandenburg Forest or the Lüneburg Heath, the past is not a series of dates, but a lingering sensory presence. The weather at Ravensbrück today remains as it was in 1944, a damp, biting wind that rattles the remaining iron gates and carries the scent of pine and cold water. But today, that wind no longer carries the screams of the Appellplatz. It carries only the heavy, contemplative silence of the tourists who walk the raked gravel paths, their footsteps a rhythmic echo of a debt that can never be fully settled. The philosophical echo of these women's lives is found in the silence that followed the vanishing. For decades, the children and grandchildren of the SS wardens grew up in homes where the war was a locked room, a space filled with the macro pride of reconstruction, but the micro shame of the individual record. The trauma was not just the physical suffering of the captured, but the psychological rot of the unconfessed. We look at the ruins of the bunker at Ravensbrück, where the concrete is now cracked and colonized by moss, a green shroud attempting to soften the memory of the stone. The sensory density of these sites is a confrontation with banality, the realization that the woman who baked the Sunday bread was the same woman who once walked the perimeter with a whip. However, the pivot of history is that while the individuals have vanished into the earth, their legacy remains a jagged shard in the national identity, a reminder that the capacity for cruelty does not belong to a specific gender, but to a specific devotion to a dehumanizing ideology. Logistics are the bones of memory. We see this in the meticulously kept archives in Arolsen and the Ludwigsburg Research Center, where millions of pages of testimony and personnel files are stored in climate-controlled silence. These archives are the final mechanical ledger of the SS Woman's service. The logistics of the Vanishing Act were meant to be permanent, a total erasure of the crime. However, the earth is a poor keeper of secrets. Occasionally, a construction project in a former Eastern territory will unearth a row of buttons, a rusted set of keys, or a fragment of a skull, bringing the macro tragedy back to the micro surface of the present day. The weather turns cold, the rain falls on the new concrete of the German suburbs, and the families who live there are forced to remember that their foundations are built atop the ash of a vanished world. The scars of history are the marks we choose to see and the ones we choose to ignore. We reflect on the cost of the Pilsen sparrows and the beasts of Belsen, recognizing that they were not an anomaly, but a mirror. The silence of the cells in 1945 has become the silence of the memorials today, a quiet, heavy space where we must ask ourselves how easily the average can become the executioner. The transition from the sharp uniform of the victor to the anonymity of the rubble woman was the greatest performance of the 20th century, a masquerade that lasted a lifetime. As we stand at the end of this saga, we look at the geography of the Reich, now transformed into the geography of a peaceful Europe. The iron cage is broken, the interrogator's desk is in a museum, and the names of the Gefolge are fading from the headstones in the village cemeteries. Today, flowers grow in the craters, but the earth remembers. The pine trees of the Brandenburg forest still grow tall and dark, their roots drinking from the same soil that once bore the weight of the death's head. The silence of the forest is no longer the silence of complicity, but the silence of a long exhausted peace. The wardens have passed into the shadows, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of the record, and the haunting realization that history is not something that happened to other people, but a burden we all carry in the marrow of our bones. The frost of the winter of 1944 has long since melted, but the chill it left behind remains, a sensory reminder that the Valkyries have fallen, but the echoes of their boots still vibrate beneath the soil of a continent that has finally, painfully learned to remember. Chapter 13. The Echo in the Attic. As the 21st century deepens, the physical voices of the Third Reich have almost entirely transitioned into the silence of the grave. On the general's map of history, the war is now a collection of digitized archives and satellite-mapped ruins. In the micro-reality of modern domestic life, the legacy of the SS women has not disappeared. It has merely migrated into the attics and the unspoken corners of the family home. We zoom in from the grand architecture of national memory to a quiet suburban street in a town like Dusseldorf or Hanover. Here, a grandchild clears out the belongings of a recently departed grandmother, a woman remembered for her kindness, her garden, and her soft, steady hands. The weather outside is a cool, sterile autumn rain, the kind of grey drizzle that seems to wash the colour from the modern world. But inside, beneath a layer of dust and cedar-scented mothballs, the hand touches a hidden compartment in a trunk. There, wrapped in yellowed lace, lies a small silver brooch, the eagle and the swastika, the mark of the SS Gefolge. The sensory density of this moment is a suffocating collision of two worlds. The cold, metallic weight of the pin against the palm of a person born 40 years after the fall of Berlin. That pivot of history is never more painful than in this domestic discovery. A generation was raised to believe their matriarchs were the victims of the Trümer Jahre, the years of rubble, who suffered and rebuilt in a vacuum of innocence. The discovery of a personnel file or a photograph in a sharp grey uniform reveals a different truth: that the person who tucked them into bed was once a person who turned the heavy iron keys on a barrack door. The philosophical echo is a parasite of the soul. It forces the living to reckon with the fact that the capacity for absolute evil can reside in the most mundane and beloved of figures. The silence that the grandmothers maintained for 80 years was not just a shield for themselves, but a heavy inherited burden for those who came after. The logistics of this intergenerational trauma are now being mapped by historians and psychologists alike. We reflect on the cost of the silence we explored in the previous chapters. It created a society where memory was a minefield, where every family tree had a branch that vanished into the shadows of 1945. The weather of the modern era is defined by this transparency, the relentless digital light that refuses to let the vanishing act remain complete. Today, young Germans visit memorials like Ravensbrück, not just to mourn the victims, but to look at the photographs of the female guards and search for a familiar curve of the jaw or a recognizable glint in the eye. They are looking for the micro-truth of their own bloodlines within the macro-horror of the Holocaust. The silence of the cells has been replaced by the quiet, frantic clicking of keyboards in search of a name on a digitized transport list. The final sensory detail of this saga is the texture of the earth itself. Today, the sites of the former camps are often deceptively peaceful, meadows of wildflowers and quiet groves of birch trees. The earth has processed the ash and the blood, turning the site of the tragedy into a site of reflection. But the scars of history remain in the way we tell the story of the women who wore the death's head. We no longer see them as invisible auxiliaries, but as essential cogs in the machinery of a tragedy that required the complicity of the kitchen and the nursery, as much as the battlefield and the bunker. Today, flowers grow in the craters, but the earth remembers the weight of the boots. And in the attics of 1,000 homes, the silver pins and the faded photographs remain, waiting to be found, waiting to be named, and waiting for the silence to finally be replaced by the difficult, necessary light of the truth.